Hungry Things, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Philip sat up straight as he faced the campfire. Rifle leaned against the arm of his folding chair. Two tents pitched next to one another at his right, their doors open. The canopy of the old forest swallowed the starlight. The moon was black, and what little firelight reached into the night was blocked by tree trunks. He stared between them to the wall of night just a few yards out, chills going up his back as his ears ached for a single sound: cracking branches, footsteps, the wind, the howl and yip of animals, the songs of insects. But there was nothing but silence and dark beside the cracking of fire and Philip's own heartbeat. Garfield sat across from him in his own fold-out chair, legs bouncing as he sat stiff, one hand kneading the arm of his chair while he chewed the other's nails. Garfield scratched his scruffy jaw and ran his fingers through shaggy blonde hair, brown eyes fixed on the black behind Philip, distant and blind as his ears sat perked. Philip clenched his jaw and swallowed before he leaned forward, fingers lacing together then apart as he warmed his hands by the fire. "We can't stay here." Garfield nodded, eyes still distantly wandering in the dark. "We've been on the move for 2 days. It's following us." "You don't know that. We might have just gone deeper into its territory. If we keep going, it'll leave us be," Philip lied. Garfield scoffed with a smirk, eyes still amongst the trees. Something rustled from behind him, and he went taut, whirling around to stare into the night like a rabbit in its hidey hole. A breeze came from the same direction, rustling the trees and low foliage. Garfield's shoulders slumped as the wind hit his face, slowly turning with a sigh from his nostrils and smiling as he found the fire. "It's following us, Phil. I don't know if it's my animal magnetism, but that thing's after us." Philip shivered in the breeze, pulling his flannel closer around him and sitting back, looking over his shoulder without thinking and dragging his eyes over the warmly lit trunks. His mind filled the empty space with figures and shapes. Every slender beam of black between the trees was a man, every lumpy branch a hunched monster, even the wind became breath. He sighed and turned back to the fire as Garfield stood, hands clenching and unclenching by his bleached denim pants. Something ghosted over Philip's nape, raising his skin in goosebumps that made his shoulders roll as Garfield put his back to the fire and faced the naked forest. He pocketed his hands, hair fluttering in the wind as he shifted from one boot to the other, his skinny frame hidden beneath the oversized aviator. "Whether we pack up or just head out, I agree we need to get out of its territory." Philip kept his eyes on his childhood friend as he combed fingers through his short brown hair and sighed. "Look." A branch snapped behind their tents. They both whirled, Philip's right hand grabbing his rifle as he bolted to his feet and notched it in his shoulder. He backed closer to Garfield until the other touched his shoulder, drawing the machete from his belt. "I told you to bring a gun," Philip said low. Garfield chuckled half-heartedly. "Give me a controller and I can shoot anything. Real life's a little different." Philip lifted the rifle as another, larger branch broke, shouldering Garfield. "Watch my back." The other nodded and turned, machete at the ready, as he flicked from the darkness to Philip and back. Philip drew a long breath, trying and failing to calm his heart as he aimed for the noises. Something heavy thudded to the ground like a felled tree, and they jumped, both whirling to face their tents. Sweat beaded on Philip's brow as the wind died and left the silence to hang in the air and cling to him like humidity. "My bag. You know where it is?" Philip whispered, eyes hard as he glared at the darkness and lowered the barrel slightly. Garfield nodded. "My gun's inside. Keep it with you tonight. I want you with more than just a machete." "Dude, you mind if we share a tent?" "I'm keeping watch. Get the gun, Gar." He looked between Philip and the silent black behind their tents. "I'll cover you. Just get it." Garfield swallowed and carefully crouched into Philip's tent, rifling through his bag and standing with the pistol in hand. "Need I repeat I'm not a good shot?" he whispered, returning to Philip's side. "You don't have to be if it's point blank. Just stick close and I'll handle the distance, yeah?" Something bolted through the underbrush from behind the tents, pulling their attention as they both lifted their guns. It moved from higher up, filling the night with scratches like it were marking the trees. They trained their barrels after it until they faced away from the tents, staring into the hollow darkness as the scratches and breaking branches got further and further away, dying with a final crash. They stood there for a moment, Philip's ears ringing in the quiet, eyes burning for fear to blink and open them on whatever stalked them, arms trembling. He sighed and lowered the rifle, shivering, though not from the chill, as the darkness watched him. "We're leaving in the morning," he said flatly, never taking his eyes off the forest. "We're packing up and going home." "Well, we wanted bonding time, right? What better bonding than a survival situation?" "It'll be a day's hike back to the trail. If it's still after us by then..." Philip swallowed and stepped back closer to the fire, Garfield finally lowering the gun. "You need to get some rest for tomorrow." The other snorted. "You can forget that." Philip looked over his shoulder at his chair and sat, rifle across his lap as Garfield backed up to the fire, gun in one hand and machete in the other. "Did you even take the safety off?" Philip smiled as the other furrowed his brow and looked to the gun, rolling his eyes and pushing the button. Philip nodded with a chuckle. "Now you can shoot something." Garfield sighed and put the safety back on, sheathing the machete as he crossed his arms. "You know I'm bad with these things. Practice more." "They hurt my ears." "All right, doggy, then wear the earplugs at the range. You should only shoot once or twice with limited ammo anyway." Garfield rolled his eyes and stuck out his tongue. "Doggy, just don't start giving me treats or spraying me with water." "There's a good boy." "Shut up." Something rustled in the dark, and they both clamped their mouths shut and faced the sound, guns at the ready and safeties off. After a few minutes of silence, Garfield asked out of the side of his mouth, "How long till morning?" Philip checked his watch in the firelight and sighed. 6 hours. Another branch broke. Then something large crashed into the ground far off, like a broken limb from high in the canopy. They shut their mouths and stared into the dark, Philip on his feet. After another minute of silence, Garfield chuckled. "No surprise here, but I don't know if I can last 6 hours. Not like this." "We'll make it to daybreak and leave. It's worse at night anyway." Philip set his hand on Garfield's shoulder, smiling unconvincingly as the other jumped and sighed when he saw who it was. "We'll get back to the trail. We're not lost, so it won't take long. Okay?" Garfield nodded. "We're gonna be okay." Garfield's eyes drifted to the ground and he whispered over his shoulder, "We just have to last until morning." 12 hours later. Philip sighed as he looked at his compass a last time to check they were going the right way, slipping it back into his pocket as he hefted his pack back onto his shoulders and motioned with his head for Garfield to follow. He took a few careful steps down the hill before Garfield called out breathlessly. Philip stopped and looked back to the other as he wiped his forehead and panted, crouching next to his pack. He motioned Philip back up and pulled out his canteen, gulping it dry. Philip faced him. "Come on, man. We have to keep moving. I want to make it a couple more miles before nightfall." "We've got hours of daylight left, Phil. Just give me a second." Garfield breathed through his nose and craned his head back until he faced the overcast sky through the canopy. Philip sighed and shifted his weight onto one leg. "All right, take a minute to rest, but we can't be long. Getting lost cost us hours. I don't think we'll make it to the trail until noon tomorrow." Garfield groaned. "I wasn't made for all this exercise, man. I'm a gamer. I don't know how much more I can keep going." "You're the one that said you wanted to get in shape." Philip held his arms out straight either side and frowned comically. "Welcome to getting in shape." "Screw getting in shape," Garfield panted. "I want air conditioning my couch in a 2-liter. "Well, you won't get it sitting there, dude." Garfield stretched his neck side to side and gave his friend a wide, fake smile before shouldering his pack and plopping down the hill, teetering his head with each step as his arms swung wildly. "Just keep smiling," he said in a childlike voice. "Smiling makes everything better." Philip chuckled and kept pace with Garfield down the hill. "Makes everything creepy, in your case." Garfield snickered and gave a real smile before he sighed. "I guess I really shouldn't complain, though." "Yeah? The fresh air finally clearing out those cobwebs?" "No. We haven't showered in a while, and all this funk probably churned that thing's stomach." The image of the trees around the campsite flared behind Philip's eyes. claw marks nearly skinning the forest of its bark, and deafening silence. There were no bugs or birds. There were no animal tracks. There were no fallen limbs. Philip made himself chuckle, grabbing a young tree and hopping down a steep fall in the hill. It was only a foot down, but the floor was loose rock, so he turned and gave Garfield his hand. I think we finally just got out of its territory. Or it found food. Whatever. I'm just glad I'm not on the menu. Garfield popped his neck before they continued down the hill, voices low. Although it does kind of hurt. I mean, how can I say I have animal magnetism if even that thing doesn't want me? I don't know, stud, but I think you'll survive to play another game yet. Here's to hoping. Who else is going to make a bunch of 12-year-olds cry and not feel bad about it? All your other friends who aren't 12. Dude, that's just you. They laughed as they wove through the thickening trees, evading the rocks and steps beneath the leaf litter and patches of underbrush. And you suck at gaming. What can I say? I like the outdoors. I'm still going to drag you into a campaign after this. Isn't that D&D? Garfield stopped and faced Philip, gripping his shoulders with a solemn expression. I have so much to teach you. You can teach me all you want if you let me whip you into shape. Garfield laughed and continued down the hill, the ground slowly leveling out. Can't teach you if I'm dead, dude. Philip pulled out his compass and checked the direction, nudging Garfield and pointing the way they should be going. I don't want us lost again. Aww, Garfield complained. But they say the third time's the charm. They chuckled, and Philip rolled his eyes as he led them on for another hour and a half until they reached the valley and the stony shores of the stream that would take them back to the trail. River rocks surrounded the water, large and little, leaving the air above clear of trees so they could stare at the gray skies. They set their packs on the shore away from the water and splashed their faces, Garfield taking off his shirt and dunking it in to drape around his neck. His pale, freckled skin stood out like ivory against the shadows between the trees as he stretched next to the water. You think it'll rain? He looked down to Philip crouching next to the water and wetting his hair. I hope not, but I'd rather plan for it than get soaked. We need to camp early. Garfield smirked and sent a small splash Philip's way with his boot, just large enough to sprinkle his jeans with water. Philip jumped back with a laugh, holding up a hand and pointing at Garfield, who grinned like a boy. Don't you dare. I don't want to add chafing to the list of cons on this trip. Garfield crouched and set his hand in the water, wiggling his eyebrows and jolting a hand an inch, back and forth. Philip protested and warned before he grinned wide and stuck his hand in the stream, splashing Garfield's arm. They laughed and cursed, sending arches of water back and forth near each other's legs and sloshing handfuls at their faces. A scream came from the forest. They froze and stared downstream, the world deathly silent apart from the blood in their ears and the trickle of water, until a second scream came. Is that an animal? Garfield whispered, still crouched. Philip didn't answer until the scream came a third time, moving further away and faster. I don't think so. Come on. He bolted up and grabbed his pack, Garfield close behind as they ran to the shore. 2 more screams came, the first in front and then the second beside. Philip cut into the forest, careful not to trip as he ran ahead of Garfield, but never enough to leave him behind. Where are you? Philip shouted. There was no answer. Are you sure it wasn't a panther or something? Don't they scream like that? Garfield panted as they stopped to listen. They do, Philip whispered, but it's running away from us, not staying still. It's too high, I think. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like an animal. Help me! Someone screamed high and shrill. Not a person, Garfield said as he jumped forward beside Philip, cursing. You're faster. Just run, man. I'll catch up. I'm not leaving you here. Just keep running. I may need help when we find her. With that, they bolted, Garfield panting like he were on Everest until they broke through a line of old trees into a destroyed campsite. They stood shoulder to shoulder, panting as they took in the long-dead campfire, the shredded tent, the fly-covered food wrappers scavenged and strewn over the ground, the clothes thrown into the broken branches of the younger trees. Someone's a litter bug, Garfield whispered to himself. Watch my back. You got the gun, right? Philip asked, eyes scanning the camp, then the surrounding forest, not listening for an answer as Garfield pulled out the pistol and held it ready. They crept into the campsite a few steps before Philip could peer into the tent and stopped when he saw the pale face of the dead woman inside. Garfield bumped into his back, earning a curse. "This was a mistake," Philip whispered, arm whirling to his pack for the rifle. "There's a body in the tent." "What?" Garfield turned and froze, face going green. "It's too old to be the screamer," Philip said, wide eyes going into the forest as he turned around to keep his back to Garfield's. "But I don't see signs of predation." Meaning? "Either the animal was defending its territory or the killer's human. Predators don't kill for pleasure, just food. I need to check if she's been eaten." Silence was his only response. "Garfield!" Philip hissed, looking over his shoulder as Garfield snapped back and put his back to the tent with a nod, gun up. Philip swiveled and tiptoed to the tent, pulling the torn fabric open with his rifle and flitting his eyes over the body. She was young and on her back, skin pale, eyes wide and milky, the front of her torso covered in blood from the gnawed gash in the side of her neck. Philip swallowed and turned on his heels, grabbing Garfield's upper arm and heading back for the stream. "We're leaving. I don't care if we have to hike all night. We're getting to that trail yesterday." Another scream pulled them to attention as the forest rustled with disturbed underbrush and snapping twigs. Garfield lifted the gun as they stepped back, but before they could move behind a tree, a girl burst into the camp and bolted past them, her hazel eyes locking with Philip's as she went, face contorted in fear as tears streaked her cheeks. "It's coming!" she screamed, panting as she ran through the camp. "Run!" Something fell in the distance, thudding like a tree until the ground shook. Then footsteps. Something galloped through the leafy underbrush, snorting and calling as it slammed into trees. Garfield bolted after the little girl. Philip cursed and called after him with a hushed growl before clenching his jaw and running to follow. His long legs pulled him faster as he looked over his shoulder to the camp, then forward to Garfield and the girl, keeping pace ahead of them. "The river!" he shouted, and both of them looked back. "Our scent?" Garfield asked as the girl turned to their right like she were on a track, Philip leaping off his left leg, arm laced with Garfield to pull him along. They came apart as Garfield pushed to keep pace, Philip looking back then forward as whatever chased them crashed through the campsite and snarled as it tore it apart, crying out in something almost human. "When we get to the water," Philip said low, "we have to run through it for a while before we can go to the other shore." Garfield nodded, breathing hard, face red and eyes heavy. "We're almost there. Just hold out a little longer." Garfield nodded with a small smile and thumbs up. "You kidding me? This is nothing. I could go all night long." Philip cracked a grin as they burst through the trees to the stony shore. He landed on a wide, flat stone that tilted under him, and his ankle buckled. He hissed and flew onto the rocks, palms and shins cut open as he shook his head. Garfield rushed to his side, pulling him up by the shoulder before he could even understand he'd fallen. "Come on, man, you're the outdoorsy type. I'm the one who's supposed to get a twisted ankle, remember?" Philip grimaced as he pushed onto his feet, the girl, no more than 13, standing at the water's edge with her long blonde hair flung over her shoulder and her nightgown torn and dirty around her shins. "Come on!" she hissed, face pale as the moon and eyes wide as saucers as she motioned them on with her hands. "Hurry, before it finds us!" "Just trying to keep you on your toes," Philip said to Garfield as he limped forward, the burn in his ankle throbbing up his leg, but not bad enough to keep him from moving yet. "Can you just focus on being the hero and saving the day?" Garfield said as they stepped into the water. "It is what you do best." Philip smirked and they sloshed to the middle of the stream and half ran in the knee-high water, the girl still in front of them, her gown dragging as she charged through it. She looked over her shoulder at them as they moved, Garfield still shouldering Philip until he lifted his arm. "Dude, let me help you." "The water's cold, Gar. My ankle feels better, really." It wasn't a total lie. The cold water did feel good against the throb, but it would be swollen by the time they crossed and made camp. Philip continued, "Let's just get moving. I don't want us ending up like that woman." The girl stopped for a moment, then moved forward again like the water moved around her. "Have we gone far enough?" Philip looked back, then pressed forward with the current, hissing as he skipped to reach her, Garfield close behind. "A little further. Then we need to find a place to make camp, okay?" "Camp?" Garfield scoffed. "We need to get out of here." "We won't reach the trail even if we walked through the night," Philip said as he pointed to the opposite shore to their right, steering them to dry land. "Besides, there'll be rain, and your temperature can drop fast. We need to make shelter and travel when the rain stops or at daybreak." "I thought this thing only came out at night." Garfield cursed and looked over his shoulder as they sloshed to the other shore, pushing through the clearing and into the shadows of the trees as the clouds grew darker.
"Maybe it's the weather,"
the girl said as she glided over the forest floor, panting quietly and looking around like a cat. "Maybe," Philip said, wincing under his breath as he pushed off an old tree to keep weight off his foot. "Are you sure you're okay?" Garfield asked. "I'll live. Let's just keep quiet for a while and put some distance between us and that thing." After that, they moved between the trees at a steadily slowing pace, Philip swallowing harder and harder as his ankle nearly failed him climbing uphill. The sun sank behind the darkening clouds as thunder rolled over the mountains in the distance, but the creature's cries didn't come again, just the ever-strengthening wind in the canopy. They stopped after another hour of travel, Philip sitting beside Garfield on a boulder with a tree grown up over it, while the girl leaned on a sapling across from them, arms above her head, forehead pressed into the bark. Philip closed his eyes and mouth and took a deep breath, letting the whisper of rain fill his lungs. "We need to make camp soon. Rain's coming fast." "Here." Philip held out a water bottle, calling the girl and holding it up. She nodded and closed the distance, taking it with shaky hands and greedily gulping until the bottle was empty.
"Sheesh, how long have you been out here?"
Garfield asked, sliding his arm out of his pack.
"I'd say here's as good a spot as any for camp." "I didn't know if I could drink the river water,"
the girl said sheepishly and returned to her tree, setting her back to it and sliding down until she sat on the ground. "I don't like it, but I don't know if I can keep walking on this thing. Get the tent started." He turned to the girl with a lighter expression as Garfield nodded and got to work pulling out his tent from the pack. "That's very smart. You could have gotten sick." She found his eyes, but didn't acknowledge him. Philip cleared his throat. "How long have you been out here?"
I don't know exactly,"
she shrugged, setting the bottle aside as Garfield slid the rods of the tent in place.
"A while, I guess."
"How'd you get here?" Garfield asked. "Was that other camp yours?" The girl stared at him, her face blank and distant with memory, her eyes flicking like she were watching something that wasn't there. She nodded. "And that lady, the one in the tent?" Philip asked with a gentle voice. She pulled her knees into her chest and wrapped her arms around her legs, looking into the forest with a stubborn pout like she were holding back tears. "Okay," Philip said. "Never mind about that. But the creature, did you see it?" The girl flicked between him and Garfield, then to the ground with a slow nod as the tent popped up on the little clearing next to the boulder. "Do you know what it is?" Garfield asked as he staked the tent down. She shook her head. "Well, maybe I can help," Philip said, pulling himself to his feet and wincing as he hobbled forward and lowered himself next to the girl with his good leg. "What did it look like?" She squirmed until she faced slightly away from him, looking forward to the tent and shaking her head. "You don't know, or you don't remember?" Philip asked as Garfield crouched next to the tent. "The other one?" Philip looked up and shook his head. "We need to be able to pack up fast, and if we have to leave without packing, we'll still have my tent in my pack." He smiled. "Quick work with that thing. You sure you're not an outdoorsman?" Garfield smirked. "What can I say? I've been pitching tents since I was a teenager." He looked at the girl, and his smirk fell. "Sorry, that was, inappropriate," and laughed nervously.
"I'm tired,"
the girl said quietly. "Okay. How about you go in the tent, and we'll keep watch?" The girl nodded to Philip and crept into the tent, looking at Garfield as she passed and laid on her side with her back to the open door. Philip stood and motioned Garfield away, limping behind the tree growing out of the boulder and saying low, "Why don't I take first watch tonight?" "You need to let your ankle heal, stupid," Garfield sighed. "I know this is your domain, and I'm not questioning you, but you can barely walk on it. What if that thing comes at you? How are you going to fight it?" Philip hefted up his rifle and patted his machete with a grin. "You need to let it rest. Besides, you took first watch last night. Let me get this one." Philip looked back to the tent and sighed. "Phil, after everything you've done for me, let me do this for you, all right?" After a silent moment, Philip said, "Fine, but you wake me up the second you hear anything, got it?" Garfield stood stiff and saluted. "Yes, sir. I'm serious. Strength in numbers. I'll always have your back, but I have to be there to have it. Garfield set his hand on Philip's shoulder with a serious smile, eyes almost black in the darkening sky. I'll kick you every time I hear the wind. Philip grinned. Idiot. Hey, you're the one with a sprained ankle who's still wearing his 20-pound pack. Here, give me that thing. Philip sighed with a nod as he slid the pack off and leaned on the tree, letting Garfield set it beside the boulder with his. Hey, what about a fire? It's been pretty cold. Philip shook his head. Rain. Plus, we have flashlights. Garfield nodded and stopped to look up at Philip, whispering, What if we have to run out of here? Philip gave a nonchalant shrug. Then we run. You can't run on that ankle if you tried, man. Seriously. That thing's been stalking us, and now we find out it's a man-eater on the other side of the shore. He breathed a laugh. I like 'em wild, but this is too much, even for me. It won't come to that. You don't know that. Philip hobbled down until they were eye to eye, his hand on Garfield's upper arm. We'll make sure it doesn't come to that. If we hear something, then we leave quietly and head for the trail. The girl? She was faster than both of us back there, and she's made it out here on her own so far. She seems to have good survival instincts. He put his hands on his hips, wincing as he shifted from foot to foot. She can keep up, and even if we're separated, I'm sure that thing'll want us more than her. We're much more of a meal. They went back and forth with plans of escape and defense in hushed voices so the girl wouldn't hear, but eventually the sun fell below the horizon, and Philip crawled into the tent. She didn't move as he laid back to back, just breathed, slowly and deeply, as he watched Garfield sigh to himself with the flashlight beaming and take his seat in front of the tent, raincoat on and hood down as he set the rifle in his lap. Philip blinked, taking a deep breath and puddling into the lumpy forest floor on the exhale, his eyes fluttering shut into dreamless sleep as the air misted with the promise of rain. When he opened them again, the sun was up and filtering through the trees. He moved, but the girl wasn't at his back. He lifted his head with a yawn and sat up, body stiff and cold and cracking everywhere until he froze, staring at the bloody body outside. He swallowed and crept over the edge of the tent door, his face slack, eyes wide as he crawled on the wet ground and stopped. He lifted a hand to touch the body, eyes burning as silent tears welled and spilt down his cheeks, following the crease of his nose. He took a shaky breath, releasing it on a whimper as his mouth quivered, contorting into a frown, a scowl, a grimace all at once. His face twisted as he rocked backward, almost bowing in the leaf litter, and took a shaky breath, his hand trembling as it crept through the air, the world blurring through the mounting tears as he touched the corpse's bloody shoulder. His face went slack. Head moved back like someone were pulling him by the hair, but his eyes were glued to it. A low groan fell from his gaping mouth, body trembling as he sucked in a sharp breath and flew forward. Like all his time hesitating made him a wound wire. He landed on Garfield's still chest, arms wrapping around him, hoisting him up and pulling his limp body into his lap. Philip whispered nonsensical pleas for him to breathe and come back and speak to him as he wiped the blood from his pale cheeks, nestling his head in the crook of his elbow and rocking back and forth, eyes fixed with Garfield's distant, unblinking stare. He sputtered a sob, heaving forward as he squeezed his eyes and shook his head back and forth, leaning low until their bodies were pressed together. He gasped, uncaring of the blood smearing his face and clothes. A twig snapped somewhere in front of him. Philip flicked his head up, eyes wide, red, and burning as they scanned the forest with what little light filtered through the canopy. He sat up, Garfield still nestled in his arms as Philip looked around, cold grief swallowed by colder fear as the world rushed back in front of him. He sniffled and flicked back to his friend's body, clenching his jaw and swallowing hard when he found the shredded flesh of Garfield's throat, the skin torn away from ear to ear, muscle hanging in gnawed strands, the sides eaten open until there was hardly any throat left. It was even worse than the dead woman. He flicked away at another snap in the forest, from his left now. He cleared his throat and gently slid Garfield onto the ground, back straight as he twisted around to look in the tent. The girl was gone. He cursed under his breath and clambered to his feet, choking back a yelp at the sharp stab in his ankle. He went rigid and forced himself to breathe, standing on his good foot as he scanned the ground for the gun, then to Garfield. The machete was still sheathed, and the gun was still tucked in his waistband. He sighed and grabbed both, freezing as a man came around the back of a tree. Philip flicked up to him and took a sure grip of the pistol, standing upright as he stared him down. Skinny, long curls pulled back at his nape, clothes like he'd stepped right out of a hiking catalog. Philip moved to take aim and speak, but his arm barely rose before the barrel of a gun brushed the back of his head.
"You'd best not do anything hastily,"
a man said. Philip lowered his hand with a growl and flicked to Garfield and back to the young man, who drew his own pistol.
"Drop the blade and give me the gun, please."
Philip growled. Fingers clenched around the handles of both weapons before the man behind him nudged the gun firmly against his skull.
"We know you didn't do that to your friend, and we don't plan on hurting you unless you give us reason. We're here to hunt the thing that killed your friend,"
the young man said.
"It's killed others. This is our job."
"Why am I supposed to believe you didn't kill him?" Philip said, voice breaking.
"Drop the weapons and we can talk."
"More like drop the weapons and you can get me out of your way," Philip barked.
"Do you think we drain the blood from people while they're still alive?"
Philip spun like lightning, gun pointed and machete raised. The other man didn't move, didn't smile or grimace or scowl. He wasn't a special-looking man, just middle-aged with scruff and long dark hair, dressed like an experienced backpacker. His dark blue eyes were steady as stones as he flicked his head to the side.
"Look at your friend's wounds. There's no blood in them. There's blood all around him, but not in him. And if you let him sit for a while, no rigor mortis."
"Why?"
"He's been exsanguinated,"
the young man said.
"Look, I know this is difficult, trust me, I understand, but your friend wasn't killed by an animal."
"I know that. I've been in these woods for years. There's nothing here that stalks like this or does that." Philip staggered, the corners of his mouth twinging as he stepped back from the man in front of him, shuffling from good to bad foot and back again.
"Then why don't you hear us, and we can put these things away?"
The man gestured to his gun with his head, eyebrows raised. "Tell me what killed him then, what you're hunting." Silence filled the air until the young man spoke.
You might call it a vampire."
"Oh, Nathaniel, must you use such modern names? Vampire hardly describes them." "A vampire?" Philip scoffed. "You think I'm an idiot?"
"Think about it,"
the young man implored.
"You said so yourself. It's not an animal from here. We've tracked it for days, and we know it's been tracking you. It doesn't stay in the dark, does it? It toys with its prey. It climbs the trees. It fills the night with noises so you can't sleep. The birds, the insects won't make any noise. Have you noticed?" Philip blinked, eyes drifting in a memory before he flicked over his shoulder and back to the man. "I don't believe in vampires." "As you shouldn't. They don't exist. But this thing does, and it's killed your friend. I'm very sorry about that, but if we stay here like this, we'll open ourselves for attack. They don't like light, but if it's ready to make a kill, then they'll come out in the day, especially with the overcast weather."
The young man stepped closer and Philip snarled over his shoulder. He stopped in his tracks, holding his hands up and putting his gun away.
"It could look entirely human. You wouldn't discern the difference. It might be a man, a woman, an elder, even a child."
Philip flicked to the man.
"So how about we put these away?"
The man upturned his gun and stepped back, hands up before holstering his weapon, and gestured to Philip with his hands.
"Please,"
the young man said. Philip kept his eyes trailed on the man and carefully let his weapons down. "I'm not giving them to you."
"Don't. I'd rather you be able to defend yourself. Nathaniel, please check for signs of contamination. I'd rather not have this man see his friend become bloodthirsty."
"Gar? He's dead. That thing killed him last night."
"Abbott, if he fed from the strig, he would have already woken by now,"
the young man said. Something crashed in the forest to Philip's right. They all faced it, weapons drawn and pointed, though the younger fumbled with his for several seconds.
"You must improve your draw time, Nathaniel. It could mean your life."
"I know.
Just nerves."
You. The man, Abbott, said, "It's best if you hide here while we find the creature. If it comes back, shoot it in the heart or head. It won't kill it, but it'll be in a lot of pain." Without checking for a response, Abbott walked toward the sound with the younger, Nathaniel, following. Philip chuckled to himself, limping back with weapons raised until his bare feet hit Garfield's shoulder. He swallowed and shut his eyes with a deep, quiet sigh, opening them as his arms lowered, and he drew his lips back in a hiss rather than scream. "Why didn't you wake me? I told you to wake me up, you stupid idiot." He whirled around and stared at Garfield's lifeless face. "Why didn't you? You were supposed to... I was supposed to keep you safe." He lowered to his knees, eyes dry and face slack as he stared through his friend. "What about all those 12-year-olds you torment, huh?" He found Garfield's eyes like he might reply, and continued when he didn't, the knot in his chest coming undone with the last of his energy. "Who's gonna lead him to victory and... God, I don't even know what stupid game you were gonna have me play." He groaned like a man come home from hard work, wiping his hand down his face and jumping when he looked up at the little girl. Her eyes were wide as she stared at them, her dress and hair dripping wet, her skin pale as Garfield's. "Where were you?" he asked.
Is he...
She swallowed and moved from foot to foot, eyes fixed on Garfield's face. Philip sighed and let his face drop to her feet in thought before he stood and gimped over to her, kneeling until he was all that she could see. "Are you okay?" He touched her shoulder, and she swallowed before nodding slowly. "Where did you go?"
I heard a noise when I went to the bathroom. I got scared. I ran."
Her voice was small and brittle as she clicked her thumbnails over one another. She chewed her lip, eyes flitting back and forth like the memory was playing in her head. Hey, it's all right. The monster's not here anymore."
"But what if it comes back? We need to leave."
She grabbed his arm and pulled, jumping back and nearly dragging Philip to the ground. He fumbled until he caught himself with a surprised chuckle, pushing back to a kneeling stance as she apologized with a high, innocent voice. "It's all right, let's just..." He looked up at her, and his eyes went wide. She wasn't the little girl. It was gaunt and starved, with ivory skin and silver eyes, white hair around a long face cut by a smile full of sharp, crooked teeth. She brought her hand down, and 5 claws gouged into his face, crushing him to the ground like a man's punch. He grunted, shakily rising to his elbows before her clawed foot found his ribs and pushed him onto his side as he curled around himself and sputtered with a broken breath.
"What's the matter?"
she asked in the same innocent voice.
"You're not scared of me, are you?"
She giggled and shoved Philip onto his back. He lifted his arm with the momentum, pointing the gun, and fired 3 rounds into the creature's gut. It gasped, eyes wide and shining in the light through the clouds. Then it staggered back, fingers curling into claws as its lips peeled too far up its face, and it fell on him, breath hot and rotten as its jaw broke open on his shoulder. He cried out, unloading the gun into its gut and chest, but it never stopped, fangs piercing skin and flesh as it shook its head like a dog and closed its maw around his windpipe. In an instant, his cry died with a crunch and snap. Then his throat slid into the creature's gut, oozing black blood as it bent its limbs backward and twisted over his chest, teeth sinking into the side of his neck as its lips suctioned around the gaping wound, and it drank from him. Philip's eyes went wide as he pushed the thing's shoulders, but it only drank deeper until his limbs tingled and the edges of the world blurred. He gurgled, spraying blood into the creature's pale hair and across his own face. It hummed, fingers and toes digging into the earth as it shifted over him like it weighed 10 times what it looked. Something crunched to Philip's left and the creature pulled away, snarling with the beginnings of a screech. The air popped with gunfire. Its face exploded, black blood spraying the air and landing across Philip's bleeding cheek and brow. It writhed and screamed like a gutted horse, arms flailing as another shot went off, spraying more black blood and casting the creature back with a thud like a felled tree. It gurgled and thrashed as the blur of the world crept deeper into Philip's vision, his chest burning with his own blood, the same blood that soaked into the dirt. Philip opened his mouth in a last attempt to breathe, swallowing his own blood and the creature's, and twisting his face into a scowl. It burned his throat, aching like it ate him from inside, like barbed wire was uncoiling in his stomach and picking out into his chest. He gasped, numb limbs spasming as fresh hot blood rushed into his chest and burned like it were full of shrapnel, coughing it up in a fountain. He turned his head, distant eyes desperate as he found Abbott, sputtering on what should have been his last breath but was just more blood, and burning as his insides gnawed on themselves. Abbott crept closer and knelt, hand on Philip's shoulder and eyes kind, remorseful, as he looked over at the creature.
"Nathaniel, sit with him. It isn't dead."
He rose and stepped over Philip for the creature with the shing of an unsheathed blade. Nathaniel fell into view and replaced the gun in Philip's hand with his own, staring like he wanted to speak but didn't know what to say, one of the last clear things left as color drained away. "Stupid boy," Philip thought, mouth cutting into a frown. "I'm dead because of you."
"I'm sorry,"
Nathaniel croaked, his eyes wet and spilling over.
"What do we do?"
he asked as the creature's screech was cut short with a swing and thud as Abbott brought down his blade.
"He isn't dead yet." "This is our fault, Abbott. What do we do?"
Philip squeezed Nathaniel's hand hard, chest burning as his heart pounded, the barbed wire slithering out with each beat. He sputtered, breath coming with the blood as he gritted his teeth and tried to sit up, tried to say something, only spraying blood instead.
"He's fighting,"
Nathaniel said.
"Did he get any blood in his mouth?"
Abbott asked, coming into view. He stood over Philip, the creature's head hanging in his hand by its pale hair, face a sunken hole of blood and teeth as its jaw slunk open with a long tongue dangling near to the ground. Nathaniel loomed closer, pulling his hand free and carefully probing Philip's mouth. Philip snarled, the gray world going orange and red as he peeled his lips back, the heat and pain seeping into his arms, his hands, his feet. He jerked forward, teeth gnashing after Nathaniel. "Get away from me, you murderers!" he thought and tried it aloud, but the words were too broken. Nathaniel leapt back until he stood beside Abbott, gun at the ready. Abbott shook his head with a sigh.
"I'm sorry, son. If you turn, we'll take care of you. It would be more of a curse to live like this than die."
"We can't take him back, can we? To cure him?" Abbott shook his head, the blade still dripping with black blood in his other hand.
"There's no cure for this breed. He needs to be buried here, with a stone in his mouth, and upside down."
"But if he's cursed?"
"If he doesn't feed, he'll be fine. We just need to deal with him now rather than later, and he'll still be human. In a sense. But we need to bring her back for study."
He hefted the head up, hand straining under the weight like it were a sandbag. Philip snarled and pushed himself onto his elbow, spit and blood flying dark from his lips as he mouthed his words around an unfamiliar voice. "Murderers! Murderers! You murdered me!" He slashed his hand forward in a half-hearted leap, fingernails long and skin pale with dark veins, stained with his own blood. He strained to sit up, but his body trembled and he crashed back to the ground with a gasp and groan, eyes flicking back to the pair as Nathaniel sighed and cocked his gun. Abbott grunted and shook his head.
"He's still human. Give him a decent death."
He held out his blade, more a short sword than machete, until Nathaniel took it and came close, foot on Philip's shoulder and pushing him onto his face.
"Base of the skull. Make it clean,"
Abbott said regretfully. Philip snarled and put his hands on the ground to push off, muscles trembling like he hadn't eaten in days. A foot landed on his back and kept him down. The point of the blade found his spine at the base of his skull, cold like burning ice, as Nathaniel let out a shaky breath.
"I'm sorry, sir. May you find rest."
The knife sank, and Philip spasmed once and collapsed to the ground, the world blurring into black and silence like he were entering a dream.
"I'm sorry."
Hey y'all, thanks for listening to the end. I hope that means you enjoyed the story. If this one wasn't for you though, make sure to check out my other videos. There are quite a few from which you can select now, and see if one of those tickles your fancy. And if you did like this video, or at least what I'm doing here, give the video a like and comment to let me know. Ring the bell so that you can, supposedly, get updates when I upload every other Friday, and subscribing would be greatly appreciated. Okay, I think I covered all the stereotypical YouTuber bases, so that'll be all from me. See y'all next time.